Hi, this is Alex from devstories.eu. Terraform Fundamentals, Episode 4 of 13. You look at your code and see a database labeled primary, but when you log into your cloud console, that exact same database is named something completely different, like db-cluster-node-1. If you want something to physically exist in your cloud environment, you have to ask for it using Terraform's most important construct, but you also have to understand how Terraform names things. Today, we are talking about declaring infrastructure with resources. Resources are the fundamental components of your infrastructure. Every time you want to create, update, or destroy an object, you write a resource block. This object could be a physical component like a compute instance or a storage drive, or a logical construct like a DNS record or a role assignment. The resource block is how you translate the idea of an infrastructure component into an API request that your cloud provider actually understands. When you declare a resource block, you define its identity using two distinct labels. First, you declare the resource type. This tells Terraform exactly what kind of object you want to build and which provider will build it. The type always begins with the provider namespace like Azure or AWS, followed by the specific service. You are essentially telling Terraform you need an Azure Resource Group, or you need an AWS storage bucket. Immediately after the resource type, you define the local identifier. This is simply a nickname. It only exists within your Terraform configuration. You use this nickname to reference the object from other parts of your code. It has absolutely no effect on what your cloud provider sees. This brings us to the configuration block itself. Once you declare the type and the local nickname, you define the arguments for that resource. Arguments are the specific settings and values that configure the object. This is where you pass the actual parameters required by the cloud provider API. To put this together, imagine you were deploying an Azure Resource Group. You declare the resource type for an Azure Resource Group, and you give it a local nickname like main. Within the configuration block, you provide the actual arguments. You define a name argument and set it to rg-enterprise-prod, and you define a location argument setting it to a specific region. When you run your deployment, Terraform uses the resource type to know which provider API to call. It uses your arguments to tell the API exactly how to configure the resource. In the Azure portal, your resource group will appear as rg-enterprise-prod. Azure knows nothing about the nickname main, but back in your code, anytime you need to retrieve the ID or location of that resource group to pass to a virtual machine or a database, you simply ask Terraform for the data held by the local resource named main. Every resource type has its own unique set of arguments. Some are mandatory, like the location for a resource group or the instance size for a virtual server. Others are optional, like tagging or specific routing rules. The provider documentation dictates exactly which arguments you can use. You just map the values you need into the resource block, and Terraform handles the translation into the API calls that actually provision your infrastructure. Your local identifier belongs to Terraform to keep your code readable, but your arguments belong to the cloud to define reality. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.